are getting to be highly polluted and not usable anymore. So I said that, but no single war has ever been fought over water. And we have seen areas where just political instability just, will last for decades and decades, but when it comes to the water, we actually see cooperation. And so with that, I have the 3 case studies, and the first one is the Jordan River. So the Jordan River is, as you all know, located in the Middle East. It's a river shared between Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Israel, and Palestine. Everybody knows of the decades-long war between Israel and the Arab states. And so the political violence and everything that's happened, and that is persisting, but when it comes to water, they've actually have now 3 agreements, and where cooperation for water is actually working out very well. So the first agreement that they had was between Jordan and Syria, and they had 2 agreements actually between them in 1953 and 1987, and this is mainly in regards to dam and use of water for agricultural and hydropower. We also have the Israel-Jordan agreement that was signed in 1994, and that deals actually with the allocation and the storage of water, and also to prevent pollution. And then finally is the Israel-Palestine kind of agreement. Even though Palestine isn't granted rights to the Jordan River, it is still part of the Oslo II Accords, in which a joint water committee will manage waters into the West Bank. So the second case study I looked at was the Mekong River. As Mon had said, it's a hot spot, and it's also a conflict zone. Mainly a conflict zone because you have one of the largest countries in the world, China, not wanting to be a part of the cooperative process in managing the Mekong River basin. But the Mekong River, and so a lot of issues come over development of dams along the river. There's been political tensions over the navigation and also fisheries on the river. But what has happened is it was actually the first successful go at cooperating. In 1947, they created the United Nations Economic Commission for Asia and the Far East, and part of that was the 4 lower riparian states of Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand. They took part in a study to want to successfully develop sustainable hydropower and irrigation projects. And again, it was, while there might still be political tensions, for the most part, this kind of framework of cooperation has led to further agreements as well. And the final case study I looked at was the Nile River. The Nile River has a very long history. We know that to go back to the ancient Egyptians, and it is one of the longest rivers in the world. And there's 10 states that are part of the Nile River, as you all know. In 1994, a scholar on resource scarcity and violence, Thomas Homer Dixon, was quoted saying the Nile River was primed for international conflict because of the downstream riparian states, their dependency on the river. And the Middle East, North Africa region, of which the Nile River and most of its states are part of, is also, most of them are fragile or failing states. They have weak governance, they have different things going on, but no war has ever been fought over water. You have the most famous agreement along the Nile is the 1959 agreement between Egypt and Sudan, which are the 2 largest downstream riparian states, and that is over the utilization, and they established equal benefits for both states. The problem with the Nile, and this maybe can be talked or questions can come from it, is how Ethiopia has kind of just been left out. The one country that is drought-ridden, probably one of the weaker states along the Nile, has no agreements advocating or putting forward their share of the Nile. So we have an impressive amount of precedents in order to go to cooperation over water instead of conflict. But I never want to say that the future can't have wars that are fought over water. I think the changing nature of conflicts that we see today I think maybe not over water, but we'll see water be more as like a tool of war, which is just as scary and possibly even more destructive than just a war over water in itself. So.
All right, any questions?
Maggie, as you look at some of these issues, while it might not be total well war, it's always possible a dam could be blown up or something occur that wouldn't lead to overall war between countries, but you still could see acts of conflict with that.
Yeah, you could, and but I also think that there's well, you can blow up a dam, like why did they do it? Was it just because the dam was built and that's the only reason, or is it because you're trying to destroy the other side's ability to do something? And so that's what I was always just kind of looking at when I was reading a lot of these scholars, is something just of why people fight wars, and that's something that I study as I'm getting my master's in international affairs is conflict. And the driver of why people do what they do, I didn't really see a lot of evidence as that was the sole reason, just because they built a dam, and that was their only grievance that they had. So.
I guess there are degrees of conflict, right?
Yeah, there are. And
everything from minor tweaking with the infrastructure of another country to at the ultimate end war.
And that's why
so
I kind of.
It might be important as you think through this, in terms of conflict, degrees of conflict.
And that's why I kind of established what I was viewing as conflict, and that was the more violent forms of conflict that you would see in war, that equal deaths and destruction of infrastructure that make society in a whole. It affects society in a whole, not just just a dam that might not really. I mean, that could affect people, but that's what I was more kind of looking at. But thank you.
Let me suggest one other consideration in terms of defining conflict. International, which would be transboundary, and internal or domestic conflict. Because I think there has been some suggestion that water, like you said, will not be a source of international conflict, but might be a source of domestic conflict. And some folks have been pointing to the Islamic State as an internal conflict, Sudan, and a few others, and they're trying to differentiate those from what's a true international conflict. So that's something just you might want to think about.
Yeah, no, and I actually do address it in my paper. Because that's more like that's what I look at the future, because conflict in itself has changed, especially recently, to me at least. So.
Your three case studies illustrate areas of conflict but not war. In your studies, did you see anything in common in the three areas that might point to why war hasn't occurred?
Yeah, I think that ultimately what it's going to be is that the mutual benefits that you get from cooperating over water far exceed any reason why you would fight a war over water. War is really expensive. It's costly via money. It's costly to human life. It's costly to your infrastructure. It's costly just in every aspect of life. So why would, in most of these countries, they don't have the economic power to even go to war also. And so I think that's more or less why maybe cooperation does happen over water, because it's needed. It's vital. Like, you need water. So why would you fight a war and then lose and then not get water? Like, that's kind of counterproductive. But you can invest the money somewhere else to water development projects instead.
You raise an interesting point in bringing up cost, and maybe there's a commonality between the conflicts, and somewhere they're doing a cost-benefit analysis and saying to themselves, well, up to this point of conflict, it makes sense, but at some point, going to, full-fledged war doesn't. So they may be, getting into disputes up to a certain degree. Does that sound reasonable to you?
Yeah.
All right, I think we do need to move on, so thank you very much. We'll move to Ms. Kehrer.
Okay, howdy, my name is Karis Kerr, and my presentation is over the analysis of management issues and opportunities on the Jordan River. So here we have the Jordan River Basin. Within the basin, you have the Jordan River, and it's a transboundary river that is 228 kilometers. The current annual flow used to be 1.3 billion cubic meters, and now it's around 100 million cubic meters per year. And obviously, there has been a significant reduction in overall flow, and that can be attributed also to the 25 dams that have been built on the Jordan River. The Jordan River is separated into the upper, middle, and lower Jordan River. And in the upper Jordan River, you have the Dan River, the Hasbani River, the Benias, Hermon, and Lake Tiberias, and those are the main tributaries. The middle Jordan River is the Yarmuk River, which is the largest tributary. And then in the lower Jordan River, you have the Zarqwa River, and that feeds into the Dead Sea. And the total discharge from these main tributaries is 1,300 million cubic meters per year, and there's not enough data about the smaller tributaries discharge at this time. The estimated population is around 7 million people, with the most being in Jordan and the rest being in Syria, Israel, Palestine, and Lebanon. And right now, the main problems that are facing the Jordan River is excess water diversion and dam building and saline and sewage discharge. In the lower Jordan River, you have a closed military zone, and so people are just basically dumping sewage into the lower Jordan River, and because it's closed, no one knows anything about it. So the Jordan River flows through Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Jordan, and Palestine. The total basin area is 18,300 kilometers squared, and the most area being in Jordan, and then second is Syria, third is Israel, fourth Palestine, and lastly Lebanon at 4%. So, as Maggie talked about earlier, there's been a large amount of conflict within the Jordan River Basin. Each one of these countries are culturally and religiously diverse, the Arab states being more similar, obviously. And so I'm not going to talk about all of these or really any of these, but as you can see, there have been multiple wars, not necessarily water wars whatsoever, but just political wars between the Arab and Jewish states. So that's just to show you that it's hard for these different country or states to agree really on anything. Oh, and currently I want to talk about that. There's obviously, you guys know, the Syrian civil war, and this is a Syrian refugee camp. And because of the rise of ISIS and the domestic disputes within Syria, you have a lot of refugees moving to Lebanon and Jordan, and these countries are really struggling to sustain the immigration of refugees. So some of the attempts to manage the water conflicts are the Johnston Plan that was proposed in 1955, and as you can see, the most allocation was for the Arab states, and then Jordan and Palestine, and Israel, and then Syria. But this agreement was never ratified because, both sides generally have adhered to the technical details and allocations, even with proceeding with unilateral development, but it was never ratified. So, and then the Arab Plan was proposed before that, and then the Cotton Plan was Israel's response to the Johnston Plan. But there has never really been an official agreement between all 5 riparian states. The closest thing, and what I will be referencing throughout most of my paper, is the Oslo Peace Agreements, and Article 40 is a really good outline for Israel and Palestine for how they manage and or deal with the mountain aquifer and things like that. And so I'll talk more about that later, but I really like the way it's written and the way it addresses both sides and their interest in the different aquifers in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. So currently, is water a source of conflict or cooperation? Right now, it's conflict, not necessarily between all 5 riparian states, because you do have some agreements, but even with the Oslo Peace Agreements, there's still conflict between Israel and Palestine, and there's no real agreement or management strategy between the 5 riparian states. So, what I have proposed is an agreement between Palestine and Israel over the mountain aquifer, and a management strategy for the Jordan River, which I'll talk more about, between the 5 riparian states. But before I talk about that, I want to say that this is highly optimistic and hypothetical. This would have to be if the countries or the riparian states could move past the religious and cultural differences. So highly improbable, but still, I think it gives kind of a refreshing perspective in a way. So the first agreement would be over the West Bank aquifer between Israel and Palestine. So although the Oslo peace agreements aren't really being used as much, I really think that Article 40, titled in the Oslo peace agreement, the water and sewage, it calls for complete cooperation between Palestine and Israel in the exchange of available relevant water and sewage data, and each side takes all necessary measures to prevent pollution or contamination of the water. So I think that's very important, even if you don't necessarily have allocations or anything like that. It's still important to address that both sides will do whatever is necessary. So that being said, you have the West Bank and Gaza is currently receiving $135 million from the World Bank, and that is being allocated for building wastewater sewage plants and fixing domestic pipelines and things like that, which was addressed in Article 40. However, Palestine hasn't really held up their end of the bargain. So in order to give them an incentive for doing that, if they developed and fixed their infrastructure, then Israel could eventually help Palestine in developing efficient irrigation techniques, and that would help an annual loss right now of 10 million cubic meters, but that's only, and then what would eventually happen is that Israel could relinquish its unilateral control over the mountain aquifer, and instead there'd be a bilateral agreement, but Palestine wouldn't be wasting the water that it's getting, and they could actually keep the amount of water and instead just get higher crop yield for agriculture and things like that. So it would almost give Palestine an incentive to develop these projects, and there needs to be some sort of water accountability on Palestine's side, and in return, Israel could help develop their country using drip irrigation, but with no monetary incentive to conserve water, they'll just continue to waste it. So that would give them an incentive, essentially. But like I said, this is very, very optimistic. So this is a little bit different. You have a management strategy between all 5 riparian states. And because Israel and Palestine have set precedent with the Article 40, even if it's a little hazy and not all sides have held up their agreement, you could introduce in a similar Oslo peace agreement with an Article 40, but with all 5 riparian states, because that would, like similar to Israel and Palestine, that would put in writing that each state will do whatever they can to combat pollution and rehabilitate the Jordan River. And with that being said, the World Bank is giving each riparian country a large sum of money per year, and those can be put towards different projects. So essentially, if they start building their infrastructure projects, then Israel, because Israel is one of the leading countries in renewable energy, and solar renewable energy is huge in the Middle East, and it might even help with climate change. And so, that being said, Israel could, if these countries are developing their infrastructure, then Israel could say, hey, you could, when you develop this, because you don't want to waste any of the water you're getting, and this renewable energy could power desalination plants. Israel already has multiple desalination plants that are powered by solar energy, and they're on the Mediterranean Sea, and they've even come up with a project with Jordan that's $900 million for a pipeline coming from the Red Sea to the Dead Sea. And if these countries are fixing their infrastructure, then Israel could help them develop this solar energy plants, and they could help with the burden of rehabilitating the Jordan River by also having, or Syria and Lebanon have desal plants on the Mediterranean as well, so it's not all put on Jordan and Israel. And because right now Israel doesn't want to put any water into the Jordan River because they're just worried that the other riparian states will take the water out. And so this could actually help, and I've looked at so many different ways to rehabilitate the Jordan River, and desalination plants are really the only option, unless you want to look at not using dams anymore, things like that. There's no other option really. So this are obviously highly optimistic, and the countries would have to move past their issues, which improbable, but still a good investment because they could all benefit from solar renewable energy plants. So, do you want references? Thanks.
You mentioned I think it was Jordan that had a closed military. I can't remember the last word you used, and that basically that means a lot of dumping of polluted material. Can you go more into that aspect? Like what? I'm not familiar with what that kind of what that was about actually.
Well, it's really just there's a closed military. It's like a safe zone, and so no one, I guess, really goes into it. But both the militaries kind of just, because it's also borders Israel as well, so they kind of just dump. But because it's closed, no one has access to it, so they don't really see how much is being dumped in there. Okay. And then that goes to the Red Sea and just kind of screws it up a little bit more.
Chris, what kind of cost do they estimate for the desalinization of water?
For the, I'm not sure for the Mediterranean, but I know that the desalination plan for the Red Sea with the agreement with Jordan and Israel is at $900 million. So very expensive, and it's a very long-term solution. But there's just not a lot of short-term right now. And
yeah. Was there any discussion on what the water would cost coming out of the desalinization unit?
I'm assuming, I didn't look at specific numbers, but for how far they will have to take the water, and especially for areas that are not very accessible, I'm assuming probably very expensive. But
okay. All right. Thank you.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you. We'll move on. Brett's going to get set up here. Can't get the camera to go further higher. Let's see.
Yeah, squat the entire time, just like that.
All right,
Sorry, it's not joke time.
hold on.
See if you can cut off my double chin.
The Zoom is not working on. Wait a minute.
Sorry about it.
Like, put the camera forward.
Sorry about you. Oh.
Guys, give us a second to figure this camera up.
I don't think it's the camera. Bigger stool. It was kind of funny when he was like, don't we have like commercials?
Oh, there you go.
Yep, that we can see you good now.
Can't quite figure out which view. We've got a split screen here. I don't know why. All right. Well, let's see if the slides go on. You guys see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead, Brett.
Going good? All right. How's everyone doing? Obviously good. Let's get down to it. So my presentation and research goes over private capital investment in global hydrocommerce and the relationship with the human right to water. That's what I call, I guess, a symbiotic contradictions that we're going to explore here. Next. Just a brief overview. First, we're going to talk about the global water economy or global hydrocommerce, and we're going to get into what we've already talked about is the human right to water. Look at some specific provisions in UN General Comment number 15. Then, based on if there is a human right to water, we're going to look at governmental obligations and whether these governments are legally obligated to provide or seek alternatives if they can't provide the access to the water. Then we'll talk about more specifics with private capital investment and global water infrastructure. And then look at some criticisms of private involvement and then some future implications. Next. So within the arena of water-related investments, I think there are real parallels between the financially motivated private sector and the human right to water, even though I guess on the surface there would be some apparent conflicts between these two presumptions. Consultants and different economists estimate that over the next 20 years, almost $22 trillion US dollars will be necessary to fully modernize global water and wastewater systems. We suggest that public funding alone will be insufficient to address this venture. But in opposition to this, human rights advocates and anti-privatization movements are often critical of private sector involvement in water investments. Specifically, my research here focuses on the relationship between the theory of the human right to water versus what I think is the reality of the actual delivery of water to fulfill this obligation to the individuals. Specifically, we can break this down into private capital investment, which I think will help fulfill the human right. But on a different note, there is the consideration of whether private investment is going to undermine basic notions of a human right to water. But here I think we're going to focus on the first bullet point there, that private capital investment will help fulfill this need. One resource economist noted there in that quote, "There's simply no substitute for water. Its value will ultimately far exceed that of oil, and it is the world's most valuable resource." So this statement makes it attractive to venture capitalist types and diversified funds and people that want to invest this sort of capital. Because fresh water is essential to sustain life, it's kind of it's unique economically, and these water equities are uniquely resistant to external economic cycles because, as we know, that demand for water is increasing, but at the same time there's a decreasing demand is increasing, but at the same time there's a decreasing supply. So the potential for long-term investment becomes apparent once we accept and make decisions from the standpoint and perspective that water is a human right. And looking at some more figures, water and the figures that we looked at on the first day, it's best to keep these in mind before we get into this deeper into these this argument. But nearly 1.1 billion people lack access to clean drinking water. 2.6 billion lack access to improved sanitation services, and 1.4 million children die every year as a result of lack of access to clean water and adequate sanitation. So clearly, this fulfillment of this human right is failing at some point along the lines, whether it's the government or private involvement, but it's not getting done, so we need to look at some sort of a solution. Next. So is there a human right to water? Looking at specifically when we ask what is the legal right, it's kind of hard to define this specifically, but we've attempted to do so in this course. We've seen definitions like every human being is entitled to have basic autonomy and freedom, and these universal moral rights, something which all men everywhere at all times ought to have. But General Comment 15 specifically, it emphasized that the human right to water is dependent on three factors, including availability, quality, and accessibility to water. And even though this isn't legally binding, this does show that there's a momentum aimed at translating these soft law commitments into substantive and legally binding obligations, which are enforceable. But specifically, you see in paragraph 2 that there's a human right to water entitles everyone to sufficient, safe, acceptable, physically accessible, affordable water for personal and domestic uses. But my question is, what happens when these people aren't getting this human right? Next. So I think that having an established human right to water, I think we're moving in that direction. It should foster business opportunities because governments cannot fill these needs to their citizens. I would ask, I don't think countries are exactly fulfilling this human right if 1.1 billion people actually lack access to clean water. So this is where we could find a solution. But the governments have three legal obligations regarding the availability, quality, and accessibility of water, which are those three factors I mentioned in the previous slide. Number 1 is to respect the human right to water. Number 2 is protect the right. And number 3, which I've put in bold there, I thought was the most important, is to fill the right to water by facilitating, promoting, and providing water to its people. And this is what I thought was most important, which could implicate, private capital investment, was paragraph 41, which says if resource constraints and the government can't comply under this human right, the state has the burden of justifying that every effort has nevertheless been made to use all available resources. I think involving the private sector counts as an available resource, so they should look at it. So just because we accept that water is a human right, I don't think this means it has to be provided by the government, and it's sometimes beyond the capacity of developing countries to fulfill this obligation. I think in 2004 it said that public bodies still supplied over 90% of the world's water and financed 90% of the developing world's investment. So here, let me give the next slide. So foreign investment contributes to the realization of the human right to water by building water treatment facilities and water infrastructure, as well as some public-private partnerships. So I guess there's financial institutions out there currently that say that water has suffered from chronic underinvestment. So there could be trends that go in the direction of investment in this industry. But because, for instance, one country, China, as we talked about earlier, plans to spend over $100 billion within the next 5 years on water infrastructure alone. So that's just one country, obviously the large one. But also if you consider India and the fact that like a third of people in Africa don't have access to water. There's definitely options out here. And so I think that capital investment is needed in these developing countries, because in developing countries where water access is the key to eventual financial stability and increase in quality of life, there are economic benefits of improving the water supply and sanitation, which could outweigh the initial investment costs and boost the country's economic growth in the long term and eradicate poverty. So this kind of shows that there is the potential to achieve cooperative solutions. Maybe next. Specifically, we all know, or y'all probably know better than I do, the engineers in the room or in Galveston, our college station, looking at this, the distribution system, which is infrastructure, which facilitates the delivery of water or discharge of wastewater. Specifically, when we try to start funding these projects in different countries, they require huge sums. A lot of times the government won't be able to provide this. So the fact that they haven't means that they're going to have to supply more and more, so they could seek private investment here. You go next. These are just 3 examples of different private equity firms, which are going to become more involved in global hydrocommerce, and this is more recently. And these are specifically focused in, whether it's in the United States or these are Arab nations, and I've seen some in Africa as well. There's definitely trends and attractive valuations of water companies compared to past years. So there could be a sustainable growth and equity appreciation in this industry. You go next. However, there is definitely a certain amount of people out there that do not think that private sector involvement should be bad, and some of them actually call it criminal. Maud Barlow, in her famous book, suggests that international financial institutions which proactively promote high technology solutions of dams, as well as desalination like we learned about earlier, are actually part of the corporate problem and only further exacerbate the global water crisis. She says there that water companies are among the worst and should be forced to leave poor countries. Then further on, she scapegoats corporations in another way that I think diminishes the potential advantages of a cooperation. She says that what many of these corporations are doing in the global south is criminal and posing a new form of colonial conquest dressed up as the one and only economic model available. My question to her would be, how can a private equity company that's investing in water infrastructure be labeled as criminal when, based on what we learned earlier, if the human right to water, these investments are within the same context of facilitating the human right to water, which the government is failing to provide. So going forward, let me go next slide. There's definitely, I think, a gap in a kind of an area that the private companies could play. But there's one interesting point that arose. There's an unsustainable gap between global supply and demand for water withdrawal. So as of like right now, if we don't improve efficiency, the global demand is going to overshoot the supply within 2 decades. Dams, recycling, and desal plants should address 40%, but the remaining 60% needs to come from investment in infrastructure, both domestically and internationally, and the development of new technology. So there's definitely important roles with cooperation between private capital investment and governments, and so it should be interesting to see where we go forward from this. Yeah.
All right. Excellent. Questions? I'll start off. How do you protect the have-nots in a private market system? Because the government may not be able to provide it, but if the corporation provides it at such a price that part of the population can't afford it, what do you do?
Yeah, I think, the most important part here is that my specific research isn't looking directly at privatization necessarily, as it's just solely looking at private capital coming from a non-government place to invest in the infrastructure.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, I think like the World Bank uses the term privatization only like when referring to like complete divestiture of the assets. And the World Bank's also mentioned that they want to start using like less politically loaded terms opposed to privatization when they want to talk about water infrastructure or sanitation specifically. So yeah, I'm definitely not advocating for all-out privatization like we saw in Cochabamba.
Cochabamba.
But it could work in certain instances.
Right.
I think, but no, definitely not across the board.
Okay. Other questions? All right, we'll move on to our last presentation. Mr. Daher.
Hello, everyone. Will hopefully be done soon. Today I'm going to be talking about Sustainable Development Goals, shifting gears maybe more from the state and basin level conflicts to global commitments and agreements, and putting those into perspective and seeing what are the challenges and that we face at that scale. And I'll be focusing specifically on the water and sanitation goal. So I'll quickly give you a quick background for those of you who are not very familiar with the Millennium Development Goals and Sustainable Development Goals. We'll go into the water and sanitation milestones until we arrive to SDG 6, which is for water and sanitation, and then talk about how do we finance those SDGs, and we'll wrap up with different concluding remarks. So I'd like to start with where all of this sustainability discussion started back in 1972, where that was the first global conference for that combined economic development and the environment in Stockholm. It was the UN Conference for Human and Environment, and global leaders met to discuss a common vision for preserving human and environment. Discussion continued until 1992, where the world women met again in the Rio World Summit and renewed that commitment and discussed development trends and reduction of human harm to environment. And this ultimately led to the Millennium Development Goals, which were announced in year 2000, which we're going to discuss in more detail in a bit, and leading to the Sustainable Development Goals, which were announced just a couple months ago, which we'll also talk about. So the Millennium Development Goals were announced in year 2000, and they were a list of 8 goals which the global community basically agreed on committing to work towards. And those goals ranged from reducing poverty, social inclusion, achieving universal education, environmental sustainability, among others. And have they been useful? My short question is definitely yes. It definitely did help us as a global community organize towards specific goals. In the 15-year term from 2000 to 2015, we have reduced extreme poverty in half, but we still have 800 million in extreme poverty. 66% more development aid has been given, but a 40% gap remains. The ozone layer is expected to recuperate in the coming mid-century, but there are also the CO2 emissions increased by 50% in the last 15 years. In addition to, so we have actually increased 50% access to improved water sources, but at the same time we still have 2.4 billion with no access to improved sanitation. So yes, they were useful, but we still have a long way to go at different levels. So the term of the Millennium Development Goals expired in 2015, and that was when global leaders met at the UN again past September, a couple months ago, and agreed on a new list of goals, 17 goals and 169 targets. What I actually did is tried to map the MDGs to the SDGs, kind of see how the global agenda has shifted priorities in terms of what was important and what are we highlighting more in the SDGs now. So we can see that the first MDG, which was for extreme hunger, now we have 2 more elaborate goals on fighting poverty and hunger in an attempt to achieve the goals that were set at the MDG earlier. We can notice that goal 4, 5, and 6, which are reduced child mortality, maternal health, and HIV and AIDS, which we've done well in the past 15 years, now are reduced under one goal, which is ensure healthy lives and promote well-being. What was most interesting was actually environmental sustainability, which during the MDGs was one goal under which it had just 4 targets, one for environmental resources, biodiversity, water sanitation, and slum areas. Now this has grew basically into 4 goals under which we have 26 targets now to meet by 2030. So it really shows a lot on the level of importance that we have as a global community have realized in terms of managing and measuring these and having quantifiable targets which we need to work towards. Some goals also which were not did not exist or were not as highlighted in the Millennium Development Goals. We have goals now on energy, economic growth, infrastructure development, inequality within and among countries, make cities and human settlements safe and sustainable and resilient, sustainable consumption and production, and peaceful and inclusive societies. So there's a long list of goals under which there are different quantifiable targets. I'm going to zoom in a bit more on SDG 6, the water and sanitation goal, and kind of quickly walk you through a few major milestones which led us to the development goal we have today. So the water discussion at the UN level globally started. One major milestone was the Mar de Plata conference in 1977, and that was a first-of-a-kind conference where it put together, it was an intergovernmental meeting with a worldwide scope which discussed issues of water efficiency, environmental health and pollution control, community supply, water supply. And there were different milestones leading to the MDG where water and sanitation was actually a target within the environmental sustainability goal. And moving into the SDG where it's no longer a target, but actually a goal within itself, under which there are 6 targets. So with the SDG that we have today, the Sustainable Development Goal 6 for water and sanitation, we have 6 quantifiable targets to reach by 2030. One addressing equitable access, safe, affordable drinking water for all. One on sanitation and hygiene, improving water quality, increasing water use efficiency, integrated resource water management through transboundary cooperation, and water-related ecosystems. So all of these goals, we've agreed on them, we want to work towards them, but a big question lies in who's going to finance them, who's going to pay for those projects, who's going to, are all countries able to support moving towards these goals equally, and how do we move forward? So I'll highlight now one of the global commitments that were made in the 1970 General Assembly, where a commitment regarding a commitment regarding official development assistance was made, where globally we agreed on reaching a minimum net amount of 0.7% of the global gross national product per country to be given as official development assistance. And this was reiterated again, that commitment figure, the 0.7%, in SDG 17 now. So this commitment is still there. So just to put things into perspective on how well we're doing on this commitment. So this is data from year 2013 and 14 for ODA that goes to developing countries. So the commitment for official development assistance for developing countries is 0.7%, and official development assistance for least developed country is between 0.15 and 0.2%. And this is the commitment, and this is where we are today. So there is still a gap that exists. So using data from OECD, I laid some countries here which actually meet the commitment today. So the red line is the 0.7% commitment, and mostly Scandinavian countries meet the commitment. We have U.S., Japan, France, Germany, Finland, even though they are one of the highest contributors to official development aid in perspective of the commitment as a percentage of GNI, gross national income, it fails to meet that commitment. In terms of development aid to least developed countries, these are the top 5 countries which contribute. So we have the US, UK, Japan, Germany, and France. But again, if we put it in perspective of the commitment, the percentage commitment, and what made me reflect on this is our discussion in class when we kept on saying, do we want to agree on a value or agree on a percentage? And we can see how different these two graphs look when you put the value versus the percentage. And when we put the percentage into perspective, very few countries actually make the commitment. And this is, all of this data that I'm showing is global ODA, and this shows specifically water and sanitation projects and funds over the years from the 50s till our day-to-day. And what's interesting here is the spike actually in the number of projects and funding after Millennium Development Goals. So in year 2000, so this is 2000 to 2010, we have a rise from 9,500 projects to 30,000 in that 10-year period the MDGs were announced. So it definitely did push funds and projects in that direction. So among the top donors for water and sanitation projects, the World Bank is tops that list. Then we have Japan, European communities, Germany, and other countries. And within top recipient countries for water and sanitation, we have China, India, Brazil, Morocco, Vietnam, and Mexico, and others. And one reflection maybe on it was interesting to see how the top donors are mainly economies which are technological economies and not only advanced, but the recipient countries are more agricultural, and maybe we'll need to reflect a bit more maybe on this, but it was interesting not to see more of Africa in the top recipient list. So some concluding remarks, just to wrap up. The SDGs are set important directions for governments to work on the right towards specific goals. Importance in quantifying and monitoring specific quantifiable targets and goals, but what tools to use. So we agree on the targets, but what tools should we use, at what scale, and at what data resolution. Importance of channeling funding in the right directions. Need to look at interconnections between that water and sanitation goal that we're talking about, and how does it compete with other goals. We need to keep that in mind, and how do we put forward different governance mechanisms which would help us head towards those goals. So I don't want to leave you waiting still. So. Any questions?
All right. Questions?
There's a line graph with some red dots and the blue percentage.
This one?
Well, it's not showing. Basically, it was at 99 billion. I think the red line was US $billion. And it was at 99, and then it drastically went down to 44.
Yeah, this is So that was for 2000 to 2010, and then that was 2010 to 2013. So
Okay.
all of those were 10-year periods.
Uh-huh.
So
it's only accounting for 3 years?
So the projection is actually, yeah, exactly.
Oh.
So we're comparing 10 years to 3 years.
So it's got already half.
Ideally, we'll be able to put 2010 to 2020
Okay.
to compare it with.
So it's already got half the money that we already or half the money that we used from 2000 2010 is already being used.
Yes.
Cool. That's what I want.
Yes.
You showed us a slide, the World Bank was a major funder.
Mm-hmm.
Who contributes to the World Bank?
Who contributes to the World Bank? So there are actually different websites that you could go to and track different funding agencies. And I saw a lot of Coca-Cola. I saw a lot of Pepsi, Cola. I saw a lot of Gates Foundation, Buffett Foundation, in different places.
Can I just?
Yes.
From what I know, the World Bank operates differently from the UN. Like just because you're a member of the World Bank doesn't mean that you necessarily have to contribute funds. So your funds are going to come not only from member states, but even from non-member states from the World Bank, and it's also going to come from NGO or like private corporations, non-state actors, and the like. Like they're all part of the people who give money to the World Bank. It's not just the UN, which it's member states only. So.
If you looked at that relative proportion of private dollars to corporations versus countries that contribute, did you all look at what the percentage and where that money's coming from? Between public and private? And the public entities, the governments that contribute, which governments contribute?
In terms of governments, I had the top 5 governments, but in terms of corporations, I'm still working on that. I still don't have that right now.
States are still going to primarily be the main donor. They tend to have the most money, but I
mean,
think
even for a lot of the UN programs.
Yeah.
So I saw a lot of UNDP operated projects.
Yeah.
Who are recipients of Coca-Cola funds.
Yeah,
So,
what corporations can do because it's private money, they can tell where they want that money to go. It's not just put into a big pool like Coca-Cola can be like, I'm going to sponsor a water sanitation project here, and they're allowed to do that. So.
but this also puts into perspective how these foundations, I mean, giving money allows you to dictate the agendas for those organizations too. So. Any questions from others?
Anyone else? All right. This has been a fantastic series of presentations. At the very least, you can see that there is tremendous amount of issues that fall under the category of water. Global water, international water, transboundary water, and we haven't even begun to scratch the surface. So kudos to all of you guys. I mean, fantastic presentations, and I look forward to next week. Thank you all.
But I don't know that. Yeah. That's my sense. Yeah. I mean, there's no way Coca-Cola can match what the U.S. would contribute. But that's an interesting dimension for the private investment.
And I mean, Coca-Cola before was everywhere. In terms of, like, there's actually a very cool website where you go over the countries and see all the different development projects that are happening there funded by the private sector. And Coca-Cola is the top funder in most of the countries.
Mostly water.
Yeah,
Oh,
this is
it's
just
different
water.
waters, okay.
This is just water. So I saw a lot of Coca-Cola gates